Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the Politics Guys with your hosts, Jay Carson and Michael Baranowski.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. My co-host this week, as always, is Cleveland area attorney and sometime Republican strategist, Jay Carson. Well, Jay, as you would expect, we've got mail. We get lots of mail, and with me taking that extra week off for vacation, we have quite a backlog of great viewer questions, and I'm ready to get to them if you are.
All right, let's have them.
Okay, first, this from Andrew. I wanted to start with this because, like I said, we get a lot of great email. This is probably one of the most sort of personally, touching, I guess you could say, emails that I think we've gotten. I just wanted to share with everyone. So Andrew writes, I just wanted to send a quick email of thanks to you and Jay. I'm a passionate and strongly opinionated person, and sometimes that makes me argumentative and angry when I feel that there is something wrong going on or someone is being hurt, especially when it's people who can't protect or defend themselves. But listening to you two disagree and still respect each other, along with your mutual willingness to look at evidence and consider both sides before reacting, has mellowed me out in every single aspect of my life. Even my relationship with my girlfriend and roommates is better because of you two. We're in danger of polarizing in America to the point where it's just two sides screaming at each other. We need shows like the Politics Guys to teach us that the only way we can truly make America great is to put aside our strong emotions and selfishness and work together, not to further our own partisan opinions, but to make this nation whole. Please don't ever go off the air. You guys are making a difference, at least to me anyway.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah,
that's really, really kind and very meaningful, and it's just one of the services we provide. I mean, yes, healing all their other personal relationships. We certainly didn't expect we'd ever have that sort of impact, but I appreciate your thoughts.
Yeah, and it's like I said, of course, that's the reason we actually started the show, is to get people to think along those lines, or at least to help people who are inclined to do that anyway. And when we hear from someone and that's clearly working and making a difference, that really matters an awful lot to us. So thank you so much, Andrew, for that. Okay, next we have Bob from Manchester in the UK.
All right.
Bob writes, hello and thank you for your excellent podcast. It's good to hear reasoned, intelligent debate when so many other podcasts nowadays are hysterical and alarmist. Well done. I just wanted to make the point that when people talk about progress and use the term progressive, there is the unspoken assumption that progress, whatever that really means, is toward something good. And in my view, it's far from self-evident that that's the case. I think there is a very strong strain of utopian thinking in the liberal movement, and while this is in some ways a good thing, it has also led to a deeply intolerant obsession with moral purity, in which the slightest non-politically correct utterance, which we all make from time to time, is grounds for ostracizing people and campaigning to get them fired and or publicly shamed. I worry that unless this changes, then the liberal movement will end up turning on itself. If this is progress, I'm not sure that I want it. I wonder what your thoughts are on the matter. Now, Jay, I read this, when I saw this email come in, I thought, well, this is totally right in your wheelhouse, so why don't you start?
This is a fake letter that Jay wrote in.
Yeah. But go ahead.
I as a conservative, one of the sort of tenets of conservatism is that human nature has no history, meaning that to some extent, as people, do we ever get better? That sort of takes the dismal view of probably not. I would be a little more optimistic than that and say, listen, I think we certainly have had a lot of progress. The way we view ourselves and our fellow men and women, as compared to other times in history. That said, I think your point's well taken. At what point does it, become something that's not helpful? The overly political correctness of our world, where people can't really speak their thoughts without being accused of some ism. But no, I think progress happens. But I'm also, as a conservative, very skeptical of the extent to which the government can enforce that progress or create that progress. And I assume when you're talking about progress in becoming better people, becoming a more
sure,
equal, living equal rights. And I'm not expressing myself well. I'm getting all cut up here. As opposed to just simply economic or scientific progress. No,
and I think, Jay, this is something that you and I have agreed on for decades now at this point. I share a lot of that view. I think that, like you, that I believe that humanity has progressed and that things are better off and we are safer and happier and in so many ways, in a more equal society and, in so many ways. And that's all good stuff. And I think that you can get into that danger of, utopian thinking, as Bob talks about it, where we say, well, if only we just took off these things that are stopping our progress, if we could only just get these evil Republicans out of the way, we could have this shiny, happy society and so forth. And like you, I am taken aback sometimes when I think government moves too quickly. Because if we've learned anything from history, we've learned that the smartest people in the room, whoever they are not nearly as smart as they think they are. And when we try to do big things too quickly, there are unintended consequences. So while I am certainly a little more comfortable with government doing things than you are, which is why I'm on the left and you're on the right.
Sure.
I also believe that when government acts, oftentimes it's better for that action to be incremental as opposed to taking great leaps forward, as it were, because oftentimes you end up leaping into the abyss and there are awful things that happen.
There was a guy a couple decades back who wanted to take some great leaps forward and killed about 30 million people doing it. But
So yeah, Bob, I absolutely agree. I think that progress is a good thing and it's happened, and certainly and the government has and can play a role in that, but it's easy to get a little bit too ahead of ourselves. And that's something that I think we on the left need to watch for, just like I think, so we tend to be on the left a little too maybe optimistic about what government can do. I think that people on the right sometimes tend to be a little too pessimistic, which is why I think it's great that we have a left and a right to sort of try to balance this stuff out. So, all right.
I just add this phrase has been around for a while, but it's popped up more recently that, politics is downstream from culture.
Yeah.
And I think that's something we look at is from a conservative aspect. You don't expect the government to create the new society. Rather, it grows up organically, and then is manifested through a government. And I guess that's if you want a better society, try to be better people rather than
no. And I think to a certain extent, I agree with that. I believe government can nudge and push and kind of form things in a certain way, but the heavy lifting has to come from society, from culture, that sort of thing. So in that sense, I guess you could say I'm somewhat temperamentally conservative on that. So
Burkean, that's a very Burkean.
There you go. Absolutely. Well, that's one of my heroes. So, all right. Next is Zach from Philadelphia. Now, Zach has a what-if question for us that goes like this. If it was found that the Trump campaign was in communication with anyone, whether it be a foreign or domestic entity, government, or anyone else for that matter, to rig the election so that Trump would win, what are the consequences of that finding? Would the Trump presidency be valid at all? Would there be a special U.S. election to elect a new president, vice president, and executive branch of government? I'm assuming that in the interim, the Speaker of the House would take over as president, but honestly, I don't know, and I think a lot of the country wouldn't know what would happen next if that were the case. I thought that was an interesting question and something we haven't delved into. I think in part because I don't think, Jay, either you or I think that anything like that is going to be uncovered. But let's say, again, this is a what if, and there are a number of ongoing investigations. Let's say that something did come up, that the president was in collusion with the Russians, about, and if this were, potential. We've talked about this before, that certain types.
Dear Vlad, please help me out, and I'll help you out.
Yeah, and obviously there wouldn't be anything like that, but there were some pretty serious allegations. If any of these allegations out there were proven true, well, what would happen? At least in my take on this is,
I think, and again, this is a hypothetical because
we're not saying the president's guilty of anything. But
I think it would be a case of the House would vote to impeach the president, and the Senate would in fact impeach the president, and then Mike Pence would become the next president.
Exactly. That's exactly what would happen. So, and that's how the process works. The House votes to impeach. If the president is impeached by the House, then the Senate conducts a trial. And then if the Senate by its 2/3, I believe it is, majority, finds that the president is in fact guilty of what he's being charged with, then the president is removed from office and the vice president takes over. Now, would that mean, some people would say, well, wouldn't Vice President, and at that point President Pence, feel the need to resign since his election was tainted as well? I mean, we can't really answer that question. Obviously, you can't get into the head of Mike Pence, certainly, but I would expect not. I think, what do you?
Yeah, absent some indication that he was
exactly. Yeah, exactly. No.
If you look, maybe the closest example, obviously, would be the Nixon presidency, where you had actually a vice president resign before the president on completely separate scandal. But you ended up with a president who had never been elected by anyone.
Yeah. So I think that if that happens, the likely final result will be President Pence, essentially.
Yep.
So, all right. Moving on.
Albeit he would have a rough reelection.
Oh my gosh, yeah, certainly so.
just as President Ford did. So.
Yeah. Okay, next we have Aaron, who thanks us for what he sees as our reasonable and insightful coverage on abortion, followed by a question, which is, could you both share what your viewpoint on abortion is and why you feel the way you do about this issue? He asks, is your position moral, civil, philosophical? I'm genuinely interested to hear from someone who's proven to be reasonable and understands the other side.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks.
Yeah.
Well, this is a tough one to do quickly. I would start by saying where I come from. I am pro-life. I come from that less from a religious standpoint than I do from a constitutional standpoint, and just as I guess a practical matter, I think Roe versus Wade was wrongly decided, in that there is not these right to privacies lurking in the penumbras, that's the language that the court used, of the or other explicitly stated rights. And I think it was, sort of the biggest case of judicial activism that we've ever seen. That said, that's the constitutional standpoint. On the moral standpoint, I think if there is a opportunity that to create have a new life enter the world, I think we ought to give that every opportunity. So, my position, I'm not an abortion absolutist, but I would say pro-life based on those two ideas. If you ask me, does life begin at conception? I think that's a tougher question, and I'm not sure. But like the court, I would agree that there is a point where the unborn fetus has a right that is co-equal, if not superior, to that of the mother.
Yeah, I agree with you on a lot of that, Jay. I'm really torn. I tend to. Well, I could have said practically everything you said. I certainly think that Roe versus Wade was, if you read the opinion, it's a pretty tortured logic in that opinion. But I agree with the policy outcome. I believe that women have a right to do what they want with their own body. And as a fetus grows, I believe as a matter of, I guess you could say as a matter of ethics, as a matter of maybe of biology, in a sense that the right of that potential human life becomes a greater and greater countervailing factor. And once you get to the point of viability, that's when that scale, tips. I think. And it seems to me that is sort of what Roe versus Wade sort of says from a policy standpoint, though it's a lot harder for me to see sort of the constitutional backing of that, that
right.
argument.
If it had been a legislative decision, that would be something different.
Yeah. But then I think of cases where, there are women in these deeply conservative states that want to ban all abortions, even in case of, rape, incest, and threat to the life of the mother. And then I think, my God, what would happen if we didn't have the protection of Roe versus Wade? These women would be put in just a horribly awful position. And so I am torn. I believe that we should err on the side of life, but I also believe that women have a right to, to do what they want with their bodies. And this is a tough question, right? You and I both agree that, and you have these different sort of rights to consider, and this is why I think people get so worked up. And I don't come at it from a religious perspective, obviously, either, and that makes a big difference. Because if you believe that, at the moment of conception, a new being is created with an immortal soul and so forth, and you're killing this life with this immortal soul and so forth, well, that's a whole different way of looking at it. I don't see it that way at all. But
and agree, and I don't know that I particularly see it that way either. But I would say I don't think that's a frivolous way to look at that. I don't think that's a frivolous argument to, if that's what you believe, then you've got to be pretty strong against it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that sort of addresses it at least as much we can without kind of going into a lot of detail. I mean, I think abortion, in the end, I think abortion should be very rare, but I think that women should have recourse to terminate a pregnancy under a lot of circumstances, under almost any circumstances, until viability, certainly. But of course, I am deeply troubled under those few instances where abortion is used as a form of birth control. I think the right exaggerates the extent to which that happens, but of course, I do not believe that's a good thing. I have serious ethical concerns with that. So, okay, moving on. A listener who's been with us from the very beginning. Episode 1, Mark from Texas. Mark writes, "It feels like my emails and forum posts are being ignored by my representatives." And Mark is a liberal in Texas. And he says, "If I vote in the Republican primary, will they be more responsive? It would feel good to vote against Ted Cruz twice in the midterm. I fully intend on being honest about my views when I'm at the precinct and Senate conventions, and I don't plan on being a fifth columnist and strategically voting for a silly candidate as a way of helping Democrats. But is there anything else I could be thinking about before I plunge into enemy territory?" Jay, what do you think? Now, I think we can look at this question more broadly. From the perspective of, for instance, let's say, like Mark, you're a more left-leaning person in a state like Texas, or if you're a more right-leaning person in a state like California.
Right. Mark, I guess I'd just say, follow your heart.
Wow. Okay.
I think the best thing to realize, and this is, I grew up in I still live in a predominantly Democratic area. And, my parents would often, register, take a Democratic primary ballot simply because that was where the only choice was going to be. There would be a Republican candidate on the ballot who would get, 15, 25% of the vote. So if you wanted to have any meaningful voice in who your representative was, you would have to choose between the two Democrats in the primary. So I understand that. And I don't think it's being a fifth columnist in those sort of instances to do that. I do think in the long term, though, that kind of voting is not helpful to your actual party because what happens is you stop building that party. So I think do what you feel is right. If you believe there is a better candidate who would win, then go ahead and vote for him. Otherwise, I would stick with building your own party.
Yeah, I think it's a great response, and I tend to agree almost entirely with that. I can see, what Mark is saying, and I think it's a great point you make, Jay. Right now, re-election rates for members of Congress are awfully high. They've been awfully high for a while. We're talking high 80s, low to mid 90% of the time. And so, like you point out, a lot of times the only real action is in the primary. And so if you have a choice of, if you want to make a difference and say you're a liberal in a conservative area and you have a chance between helping to promote a more or less conservative candidate, you can certainly understand that. And I agree, it's not a fifth columnist sort of thing to do. It's a reasonable thing to do. But as you point out, then you want to build your own party, because in the long term, that's what's going to provide a real alternative. And so I think it's maybe, you take that longer or shorter term sort of look, but it certainly can be frustrating to be in an area where it just feels like that your voice isn't really being heard. All right. Moving on. Next, we have another longtime listener, Emily, from Ruislip, just outside of London, England. Emily writes, "What do you guys make of the recent student protests at Millbury College against Charles Murray? I can understand both sides of the argument, whereby some students felt particularly aggrieved against Murray's conservative views, such as the views he espouses in the bell curve, but I also don't agree with the attempts to silence free speech, as it is our constitutionally enshrined First Amendment right. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, especially Jay, since as far as I can remember, I think he has recommended a couple of Murray's books on the podcast." Jay?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Emily. And Emily, from being one of our original fans, introducing us to the UK, which has been fantastic. I am a big fan of Charles Murray, and I think his books, again, particularly Coming Apart, is very important. Students have a right to protest if they don't like something, but it's also something different to shout someone down. And I think Murray's views, if you read the bell curve, he doesn't say what they say he's saying. In fact, in numerous occasions, he said he thinks racial differences in intelligence are minimal or are insignificant. When you look at the bigger picture of human intelligence, those distinctions are small and again not terribly meaningful. And I think he's generally a very nice, decent human being. And if you've read some of his other stuff, it's very much about let's come together and be more of a pluralistic, but at the same time unified society. I am heartened by some of the reaction to the Middlebury College stuff, and that being the professors who have signed an online statement decrying what happened, and going so far as to make statements such as, "Look, it's not the college's job to make you feel happy with your own values. It's not if someone says something you disagree with, that's not violence." And I think that's hugely important. If you want to disagree, you can carry a sign outside. You can go inside and maybe ask a pointed question if that's the format, but simply shouting someone down. And then, this was actually a violent attack where one professor was hospitalized. That's mob violence, and that's something we should oppose at absolutely every level. I guess the final point is, how did it get to this, that students thought that this might be okay? And that's maybe the more troubling question. I mean, Mike, you and I have sort of fought the forces of political correctness for 20-some years now. I suppose less now that we're out of college. But, this was very much something that, look, 20 years ago, this was something I was concerned was going to happen eventually, that you would get this sort of sense of it's almost an entitlement of, look, I'm so right, I'm allowed to be violent, I'm allowed to be wrong, and that's really what leads societies down some dark paths. So,
yeah, I agree entirely, Jay. I'm sure it doesn't come as a surprise to you. And in fact, I agree with your assessment of Murray. He's been incredibly mischaracterized, and like you, I feel this is part of a bigger, more troubling trend of people not really trying to engage with other folks' ideas, but just simply shouting them down. And I think that, certainly there are a lot of ideas out there in the alt-right and other sort of things that are repugnant. But the way to...
But we should point out, Murray is certainly not an alt-right.
No.
He's certainly not a Bannon or a...
no, but
who's the other guy? Milos kind of character.
Yeah, but I would even support the right of somebody like that, an alt-right person, to speak, because I actually want those views to get out there. I want those views to be challenged in open, and public debate, so people can see how ridiculous, how awful, how repugnant they are. But by shouting,
I think there's. I'm sorry to keep interrupting.
No, it's okay.
But this is a good point. There's also a difference between debating and debunking those ideas and shouting them down.
Yeah.
Which I think is what you're talking about is the former. Let's let them get out there and then, pull them apart and look how ridiculous this is, rather than just simply shouting them down saying you're a racist.
Yeah, I think one thing we've learned over history is that shouting someone's ideas down, that really doesn't work in the long term. It ends up being self-defeating. And sure, maybe you feel good about yourself for doing that, but in the long run, you actually are working against your interest, which is if you in fact have the better ideas, the ones that are more palatable to people, that are better for, human progress and society and equality and so forth, well, put those ideas out there and, put them up to the challenge against these other ideas. And if they're better ideas, this is what we believe in terms of how democracy is supposed to work, those ideas will win. And if not, then we need to get into questioning the whole nature of democracy, which is, of course, another conversation without a doubt. So, all right, moving on.
Thank you, Emily.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Always great to hear from you. Next, we have Jessica from Los Angeles. Jessica has become a regular presence in our email inbox, and she always has thoughtful and interesting things to say about our shows. She recently took issue with what she called my incredibly silly comparison of segregated water fountains to transgendered people using the bathroom of their choice. Jessica explains, first, it's silly because there is actually no widespread and systematic discrimination against transgenders as there was against blacks. Secondly, it's not natural to choose your gender. To have a penis and choose to live as a woman is a choice, and it's a choice that, quite frankly, makes a large percentage of Americans uncomfortable. Thirdly, there is only one difference between black people and white people, the amount of melanin in their skin. Men and women are different. They have different hormones, different physical abilities, different brain usage, different developmental needs, and different cultural responsibilities. Procreation. To argue otherwise is anti-science. It's totally inappropriate for any governing body, politically or culturally, to wake up one day and decide to redefine gender and throw it into the left's catch-all bucket of civil rights. Doing this has incredibly far-reaching implications that go far beyond using a urinal or not. So there was a lot there, obviously. So, okay, Jessica, as to Jessica's first point, I would disagree. I believe there is widespread and systematic discrimination against transgendered people. And so right there, I think fundamentally we disagree. But on her second and third points, or on your second and third points, Jessica, because I hope you're listening, I agree that being transgendered is different from being a member of a racial group. But I don't agree that it's exactly a choice any more than I believe that people choose to be homosexual. Now, I'm certainly not anti-science, but my understanding of the science, which admittedly is, from a layman's perspective, is that there are in fact genetic predispositions to gender orientation, though at this point we don't really understand them very well at all yet. And so I don't really have a problem with states or local governments, passing this sort of legislation. I think we should let the democratic process work its way out. What I have a problem with particularly is when state governments decide that they're not going to let local governments do this, which to me seems to be kind of fundamentally against what conservatives believe, in that local governments are closer to the people, and so therefore they should be the ones who are making these decisions, where in some states they said, well, yeah, we believe that, but in this case we're going to pander to our far-right constituencies and not let the local governments do that. Jay, any thoughts on this?
Well, I think Jessica's, hit a lot of good points. I would agree. I think transgenderism is something different than racial discrimination. Not that transgendered people aren't discriminated against, but that it is a much rarer, different sort of situation. They are what the Supreme Court would have called discrete and insular minorities. There is not a one sort of I guess transgender group or like a transgender neighborhood or you know what I mean. It's individuals here and there, which to me supports what you sort of said is let's handle this on the most local level possible. And also was this ever really a problem? Again, discrimination against transgendered people may have been a problem, but it was not the type of Jim Crow type problem.
I hear what you're saying. I think though
there was never legislation, there was never a system designed to keep transgendered people down. It was just sort of, it was de facto rather than de jure, I guess.
I feel like in a lot of ways this is. There are certain similarities between this and the sort of issues of homosexuality. And, as, for instance, for a long, long time, homosexuality was clearly something that was not just frowned upon, but actually illegal. And until very recently, actually, there are still laws on the books, in fact. And a lot of people who were gay were in the closet and so forth. And so the homosexual population was greater than what we thought because people had been just so the entire culture basically pushed against this. And now as our culture has become more open and welcoming to these differences that, as I said, science believes, I think in many cases actually have some genetic determinants, that we're finding out that things that maybe in the past we thought were choices actually aren't choices. And to me, kind of the fundamental basis of civil rights legislation is to protect people from being discriminated against based on things over which they don't really have control. And as science, more and more shows that there are other things just than race and gender that are like this, then I think civil rights legislation should adjust to take this into account.
All right. I mean, I get you on the, I would agree that I don't see being transgendered necessarily as a choice in that there may be an ultimate choice to say I'm going to have reassignment surgery procedures, what have you. But I agree. There's something else there that you have the feeling that you're in the wrong body.
Yeah, because it's hard. I think it's hard for most people to say. Well, someone would say, "Hey, I think I'll be transgendered," as like, "Hey, I think I'll root for the Reds" or something like that. I mean, it's it obviously that's not what goes on. And maybe I'm oversimplifying the argument. In fact, I know I am. I think people on the right who object to this sort of thing would say, well, it's not like that. It's more the case that society kind of subtly pushes people and makes them question these things that they shouldn't be questioned. Now, I disagree with that, but I think there's,
I don't think the two have to be mutually exclusive.
No. Yeah, so I just wanted to make sure I wasn't, creating a straw man sort of argument here. So, all right. Next we have Dave from San Francisco. Dave writes, would you guys please take a few minutes to define the underlying philosophies and principles that define the terms liberal and conservative? And I also think it would be great if Jay made the case for liberalism and Mike made the case for conservatism. Intellectually, you are both up to the task. Thanks, Dave. I hope we are. And you'd help set the example of political discourse that we should all be having. I mean, if someone can't explain the opposition's position, how can that person legitimately oppose it? Keep up the great work. I thought that was a great point that Dave makes.
That is.
And I think that's also one of the best ways to try to understand the other side of any issue is to try to make the case for that. And once you start to do that, and there's been some research on this too, suggesting that that's one of the best ways for us to get out of our filter bubbles is to not just read stuff or watch stuff that the other side is putting out there, but to actually make the strongest possible case for that side. And that really does something to your mind in a very kind of literal way, some research has said. So I do think we're up to the task. What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
so should I start with the how I would define liberalism?
Yeah. Now, to be fair, we should point this out. Since I have, in fact, in the past been I was never a card-carrying conservative. They never gave out cards, but I have been on both sides.
Heritage Foundation intern.
There you go. I was, in fact, a Heritage Foundation intern back in the day, so I have some serious conservative credentials. I was a big fan of the movement, further right than Jay was. So this might be a little easier for me than for Jay, but I know that Jay's going to do a great job. Go ahead, Jay.
Sure. First of all, I do want to define what we're talking about, liberalism and conservatism, as those terms are used in contemporary, America or Western Europe,
Yeah, great point.
as opposed to sort of the classical liberalism, which is more actual conservatism now.
Yeah.
But I would say liberalism begins from the idea, and this was expressed by Thomas Hobbes, in that life is nasty, brutish, and short. Things are really crummy, and people, because of this, need a protector. And they find that protector by joining together to form governments. And that those governments then have the power and the authority and the moral responsibility to take on the betterment of humankind and to address the inequalities of life where they arise, and to sort of pave the path to even out those further inequalities. So that was Hobbes talking in England in the 1600s. Rousseau picked up on it with the idea of a social contract. And Rousseau's idea was a little different than Hobbes. He thought actually things were pretty good until we had governments, but we can have better governments. And he very much believed in sort of the revolutionary type, taking a big step. And the French Revolution is big in liberalism, in that it infused also the idea of rationalism, of we're going to throw out the religious part that it in part of government, which we tend to forget, but that's how governments really organize themselves for most of history. And we're going to be governed by pure reason. Now, it didn't work out so well for the French because it turns out some of those people were not terribly reasonable. But that it was the same idea of you would have a government that was devoted to the people and sort of devoted to secular governance rather than looking for sort of divine principles to guide itself by. And that is also what was espoused in modern day liberalism, the belief that, listen, there are inequalities out there, and the government is the only entity with the power to fix those. And they therefore ought to do that and again, it ought to be, eliminating racial inequalities. It's grown to other things we just talked about, transgender, so forth, that no one ever wouldn't have imagined in Hobbes's day. And as well as the economic inequalities. So I guess that's my take on what liberalism, the principles that undergird liberalism. Maybe there's a few other steps that you can say in terms of what types of government actions. A lot of, making work programs, a lot of government spending. The idea is you spend a lot. That comes into the Keynesian economics of you sort of spend money to make money. That government spends money, it goes out and is circulated through the system that way, as opposed to the idea of government not collecting the money in the first place. But
okay.
Was that reasonable? You think?
Yeah, I think so. I might have stressed a few things a little differently, but yeah, I think you did a pretty good job. I hope I can do as good a job. Now, my job's a little different in that there are pretty clearly, I think, two still very strong strains of modern conservatism. There's the libertarian strain, the kind of, you call them the freedom conservatives, I guess you could say. And then there are the cultural conservatives, and they're a very real force in modern American politics. And so while they kind of come together in sort of an uneasy coalition, I think they need to be considered separately. And so I'll start with the group that's sort of still, to a certain extent, I feel a certain affinity for, and that's the freedom conservatives, the libertarian type folks. And their basic belief, I think, is that government, is that freedom is one of the most important values, and that, in fact, one of the key things the government was formed to do is to promote and guarantee the freedom of people within the state. And then that's important, not just because freedom sounds like a good thing, but that the bigger government gets, there's a tendency for power to corrupt, and for big government to start becoming oppressive and to limit the freedom of people. And, more than just limiting the freedom, whereas, you say, well, you can't go out and shoot somebody else just because you're having a bad day. I mean, there's no one who thinks that's a good idea. But essentially being coercive and forcing people into what's an oppressive state, essentially. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think certainly that big government can be sclerotic, can be oppressive, and can do some serious damage to people's liberty, and that's something that we need to keep in mind. Along with that, I think, is the argument that the people acting on their own or through the market tend to make better decisions, tend to come to better ultimate outcomes than one sort of centralized authority that's making decisions for the entire country, especially when it's a large and diverse country. And I think there's something to be said for that as well. I don't think it's as broadly applicable as many conservatives would say, but I think that that's a very serious argument that, should really be considered, and oftentimes isn't perhaps considered as much by liberals as it should be. So that to me is sort of the libertarian type of argument. Now, the cultural conservative argument's a little bit different. And this is that, that a country is more than just a series of laws. It's a series of beliefs. It's a community. It's a group that comes together, believing in certain things, and things that we're bound together by more than just laws. We're bound together, even more importantly, by traditions, by the dead hand of the past, which actually isn't so dead, that has formed what we are today. And when we make big changes to that in the name of progress, we're disturbing a lot more than we really might expect. And a lot of those changes are going to end up causing some real damage to our society in ways that we can't possibly comprehend because we're not nearly as bright as we think we are. And I think there's something to be said for that as well. That seems to me to be entirely reasonable. Certainly there's a long history of liberal hubris and arrogance about progress, something we talked about earlier. And so I think that those cultural conservatives, can make a reasonable case and do have some reasonable points about that, although fundamentally I think obviously I part ways with them. So those, I think, are the two kind of strains in conservative thought. What do you think, Jay? Did I?
I think that was very well said. I think that was a good definition there.
It's difficult for me, as I'm sure it was for you, in kind of making that case to not raise objections to the own points I was making, and to listeners say, while we may not agree with those, I think, we at least feel like we understand where the other side's coming from, which I think is pretty important.
Sure, and I would just add to what I said that the idea of having a regulatory state, in a lot of ways, look, I think it's pretty good we have an FDA. That's sort of that would be something that a traditional liberal, in the old days would have said, this is something we need. This is a place where government can step in and make people's lives better, and where the market doesn't do enough to govern itself.
Yeah.
So, look, I think we agree on a lot of those things.
Well, I think that the fundamental thing that we agree on is that none of these views is illegitimate, and in fact that it's the interplay of all these views that I think helps to keep the excesses of each of them, if taken in and of itself, in check. And I think that's the great thing about an open society, is that we have these competing views, and it's that tension that is so important. It's the tension that kind of keeps the whole thing going and from from coming off the rails. And so while it's easy to, get really upset with these other views, I think it's important to know that we need these views just like we need both sides in an adversarial system of justice. That's why we have defense attorneys and prosecutors, because it's that tension between those two things that makes the entire system work. And I think that's how democratic societies work as well.
Yep.
All right. On that note, I think that about does it. We kind of run out of time for this week. So thanks everyone for listening. If you have any questions for future episodes or any thoughts, comments, criticisms, we would love to hear from you. Our email is mail@politicsguys.com. Our Facebook page, where we post throughout the week, is facebook.com/politicsguys page. And we're also on Twitter @politicsguys. And we'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the show, leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever podcast service you use. And sharing and retweeting our new show posts and tweets also helps out a lot. If you'd like to support the show financially, well, you can do that through the Patreon or PayPal links on our website. And if you enjoyed the show, check out the Politics Guys weekly newsletter. You can take a look at previous newsletters and sign up to have it delivered to your email inbox on our website, politicsguys.com. We'll be back with a new show next Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.